Okay, so we've figured out where Syria fits strategically. Now, if we remember, in the 1990s, President Clinton faced a choice in Bosnia, and it's pretty analogous to what President Obama faces today in Syria. After 3 years of a bloody sectarian war, Clinton finally agreed to step up NATO military action in 1995. And by year's end, or at least as the story goes, military pressure actually persuaded Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic to come to the negotiating table. Now, he reached a peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio, in November.
I was in the Clinton administration at the time. I remember this vividly, and I think it's a very relevant case to compare. Yeah.
Now, we've got a slightly different case, Graham, in Libya. So just days after Colonel Gaddafi threatened to exterminate a budding rebellion in the east in 2011, he called the rebels in those regions rats and cockroaches. The UN Security Council actually authorized NATO military action. This was March of 2011. There was a no-fly zone, and then there was a bombing campaign that was intended initially, or at least President Obama said, to protect the population against their own leader. But it quickly became a hunt for Gaddafi himself. And all that summer, they were basically chasing Gaddafi across the Libyan countryside. So by August, the Libyan capital of Tripoli fell, and for much of the summer, Gaddafi was being chased across the countryside long after it was clear that he wasn't going to be much of a threat to his own people. Eventually, he ended up hiding in a trench. He got pulled out by Libyan rebels. He was executed within an hour or so. It was not exactly the kind of exhibition of clear justice through a tribunal or proceeding that I think the United States and many of its allies had in mind. But nobody stopped at that. And Libya since has been a very, very mixed picture. But the U.S. clearly has had some success with limited interventions. The same cast of characters that participated in Bosnia and Libya, though, the U.S. and Europe, have been dragging their feet on Syria. So I guess my first question to you, Graham, is why the inconsistency?
Well, it's a good question. And I think, first, in general, policies don't have easy consistency because specific cases differ. But I think particularly as we think about the case of Libya or Bosnia, they're both relevant analogies and they're appealing analogies, especially for people that say somebody has to do something and we did something in those cases, we can do something in this case. But we had a great colleague whom you and I both studied with and learned from, Ernest May, now deceased. And Ernie and Dick Neustadt wrote a great book called Thinking in Time. And one of the devices they propose when you're thinking about a historical analogy is you take a sheet of paper and you write down on it Syria and Libya. And then you put a line down the middle of the page. And on the one side you write similarities, and on the other side you put differences. So 2 columns. Then you make your bullet points going down. And I would say, having thought pretty hard both about the Libya case and the Bosnia case, while there's superficial similarities, the differences are much more profound. But let's see, the members of the class ought to be able to do this pretty easily. So let's do first Libya and Syria, similar and different. So who wants to start filling out some bullet points for similar, and who wants to fill out some bullet points for different?
Andrew, you want to start up on that one?
Sure. So for Libya, obviously the similarities are the context that we discussed before, how it started as a peaceful revolution in the East and very quickly escalated into what became a civil war. The leader himself did not have a lot of legitimacy in much of the country, and that made it much easier for the rebels, or what became the Transitional National Council, to convince people to come to their side. But I would say, as Graham said, that the differences with Libya are definitely profound. To start, and I think the most important point is that because Gaddafi made these references like rats and cockroaches, that he very quickly lost any prospect of external support, unlike Syria, where you have the regime that still has its external backers.
Well, Gaddafi was already a pariah in effect, whereas in the case of Assad, he's got strong support from Hezbollah in Lebanon, he's got strong support from Iran, he's got support from Russia. Gaddafi had pretty much managed to estrange himself from.
Well, he had, Graham, but as you say, historical memories are short, and Gaddafi was supposed to be the example of the former pariah who went good. In the years before the Libyan revolution, he turned over his very nascent nuclear weapons program to the U.S. and the IAEA. It was still in its boxes. You'll remember there was a parade of officials who would come to sort of bring Gaddafi back in. He had long sessions with Tony Blair of Britain.
He
Condoleezza
was received with open arms in France by Sarkozy.
Right. Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time, went to go visit him, and he later on was writing musical odes and scrapbooks. Makes you wonder. But in this case, the United States had gone and basically made every indication that they were going to accept him back into civilized
Sure, and had
society.
assured him of that. But once he got crosswise with the U.S., France, and Britain, he didn't have any reliable friends in the Arab world, and there was no Iran for him. There was no Russia. So I'd say that's a big one. What else? Yeah. Similar or different?
Or any others here?
Well, we already talked about just the different contexts, like geography, population, force of military, and those things certainly make a big difference as well.
Okay, so you put that in the difference column,
Yes.
yeah. Other differences.
Well, as you said, the Assad regime has much better military capabilities than Gaddafi did. And in addition, I would say that the political organization of the opposition in Libya was much better than it is in Syria. The Transitional National Council definitely was better organized in that regard.
And geography matters, as we said before. You could actually take out the Libyan forces in the desert without collateral damage. Whereas the idea of sending in fighters, drones, whatever, to go try to deal with the Syrian government forces inside the cities would be a horror show, perhaps even bigger than what we've seen already. Jess, you look like you had a few on your list.
Yeah, I would just add that I think in Libya we had, or at least thought we had, a better sense of what would happen if Gaddafi fell, and that we would be left with a situation that we could manage and would be okay with, and potentially have a partner there who is going to be willing to work with the U.S., and we really don't have that confidence in the Syrian case.
Well,
I think this is a good one to sort of leave students to wrestle with. But I would say on my list, I've got 7 big bullet points of differences in the case of Libya versus Syria. For example, in the case of Libya, there was a UN Security Council resolution authorizing Chapter 7 action against Gaddafi, for which was not vetoed by Russia or by China. What's the chance of that in Syria today? 0. I've heard Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov on 2 separate occasions in which he shows you his scars. He believes that he was snookered. He was told this was going to be a humanitarian mission, which was the
In Libya.
In Libya, that the purpose was not to topple Gaddafi or kill Gaddafi, and that, in fact, that's what he assured Putin, and lo and behold, we tricked him. And I would say he thinks that because that's what happened. Say his story is pretty close to the mark. So no UN Security Council resolution. In the case of Libya, you had an Arab Council resolution calling for the ouster. In this case, not so, because you've got significant divisions. So I would say it's at least worth going back to old Ernie May's good line, do the similarities, do the difference, and weigh them up for yourselves. We should probably also look briefly at the Bosnia case and do the same exercise, or maybe that's a good one to leave for students to think about for yourselves. Go back again to Ernest May's proposed methodology in which you draw a line down the middle of the page and do similarities and differences. And think about Syria and Bosnia. When I make my list of similarities and my list of differences, the differences hugely outweigh the similarities.
Well, I think it's worth remembering Ernie's warnings here. He once accused me rightly of failing to do that line as I was showing him the chapter of a book I was working on. So I went back and did my homework and would recommend it to all of you.
And I bet the chapter got a lot
And
better.
the chapter definitely got a lot better. But he also would always remind us that history never repeats itself, it just rhymes. And
Mark Twain's good line.
it was, and so I think that's probably a good place to end this segment. And then when we come back, let's take a look at another of the really interesting differences, which is on the Syrian battlefield itself, as we begin to look at who's fighting whom. Because one of the biggest differences here is we're not quite sure who the United States and its allies should be allied with in Syria itself.
Absolutely, that's another big difference.